everyone, welcome to the November 10th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. I'm David Aragon, and I'll be joined very shortly by my co-host, Craig Milkowski. Well, this week on the podcast, it's our Breeders' Cup recap show. We'll be taking a look back at all 14 Breeders' Cup races, plus one notable race that I think a lot of people want to get our take on that took place between the two Breeders' Cup days early in the day on Saturday. But the focus here is really the Breeders' Cup races. And Craig, I don't know about you, but after these 14 race Breeders' Cup weekends, I always feel like I have a hangover the next day. It's just almost too much racing to deal with in a short period of time.
Yeah, you're not kidding. After that on Sunday, I just sat around and watched football. I don't think I watched a single race, which is something that almost never happens. But it is, as you said, it's exhausting. And all the races are, well, for the most part, are deep and competitive. And I really think they push their mental limit. So it's good to get that break after. But I thought it was a great weekend of racing.
Yeah, it is helpful, I think, to go back in retrospect and reassess these races because they come at you so fast and furious when you're going through these cards. Sometimes you don't have time to really digest the results. So let's try to do a little bit of that. And we're going to start at the end of the Breeders' Cup weekend with the Classic, and we'll work our way backwards. And this Breeders' Cup Classic, there was a lot of talk coming in about how evenly matched this field was. Some people were saying this was one of the best classic fields ever. I certainly would not have gone that far, but I will say that it was a group of horses that looked like they were evenly matched coming in, and often in situations like that, the horse that gets the best trip turns out to be the winner, and I think that was the case here, as the pace situation looked a little murky prior to the race, and it really sorted itself out once they got on the track because John Velazquez had a plan to go to the front. Nobody really challenged him on Authentic, and you could tell that the race was really going to play out with this horse wiring the field as they were coming around the far turn because everybody else was off the bridle, and he was going pretty easy.
Yeah, I think this is one of those races, we talk about the pace projector a lot, where sometimes you just have to really look in between the lines and read things for yourself. And it was a race where we showed the pace was going to be fast, but then when you looked at it, we had Maximum Security on Authentic shown up on the lead with a big gap to the rest. And for me, I thought it was pretty obvious that those two weren't going to duel, both being trained by Bob Baffert. It was just a matter of which one you thought would make the lead, and I thought that would be Authentic, and he did. And unfortunately, there was a timer malfunction. I think somebody set the system up wrong. They didn't set it up for a 1.25 mile race, so we didn't get any fractions during the race. I wound up using the Trackist times, as did Andy Beyer, and we came to that conclusion independently, so I think it's the right one. Neither one of us trusted the time that was provided in the chart, which I'm not sure how they got it. You can't really video time that distance at Keeneland because the angle is just too severe. There's no way to really see where the start line is. So I trusted Trackist here, and I think it's fine. But doing that showed that they were pretty moderate fractions. They weren't quite enough to be coated in blue, but I don't think Authentic could have asked for an easier trip. It was a moderate pace. He was clear on the lead. And he's just too good a horse to let that happen. We saw it in the Kentucky Derby where he never got challenged and he just kept going. And the same thing happened here. And the one thing I find funny is he's a horse who a lot of people, including myself, thought 1.25 miles might be a problem for him. And his two biggest wins have come at that distance where he was allowed to set the pace and control it. So he wound up with a really solid 130 TimeformUS speed figure. His previous bets had been a 129 in the Derby. I wish we could see this horse as a 4-year-old. Unfortunately, it was announced he's going to be retiring. He won't even run in the Pegasus or any of the overseas races, so that's a bit disappointing. But it was a top-class Grade 1 effort for sure.
Yeah, we saw a few races over this 2-day weekend where other riders kind of recognized that there was a clear favorite in a race and they rode the race to beat that favorite. And that was not the case in this Classic. I think the other riders just sort of underestimated Authentic. I mean, he was up by about 2 lengths through a very moderate opening quarter heading into that clubhouse turn. And you just can't beat a good horse when you give him that kind of tactical advantage. And I mean, maybe there was just no other speed in the field. I mean, I kind of thought that maybe Global Campaign would be ridden a bit more aggressively, but they chose to rate him. He ran a nice race, but there was no way he was passing Authentic after that horse got such a soft trip. And there really just wasn't a whole lot of closing from the back of the pack. And I think that speaks to what you said, how moderate the pace was. I mean, really, the only horse that made up any significant ground in this race was Tacitus, who I will say probably ran the race of his career to be fourth in here. But there was no catching Authentic given that soft setup up front.
No, and there were definitely some other good efforts in here. Improbable, I thought, ran very well given the pace scenario to be second. He was wide. He made a good run and actually looked like he was going to win, maybe win the race turning for home, but Authentic just had too much left. I think Global Campaign showed that he's a really top grade 1 horse. Stanley Huff has just done a great job with him this year. He kind of had an aborted 3-year-old campaign where something went wrong, but he's come back in top form. And if he continues on next year, he's probably going to be one of the best horses in the older division. Tacitus, he's Tacitus. He ran very well. I think if you had to pick a spot he was going to run in this race, most people would have guessed fourth, and that's where he was. And there's just so much we could talk about. I was a little disappointed in Tis the Law. I wasn't thrilled with the ride that he got, but I also don't think he ran as well as he could have. He did kind of get taken back off that pace in behind horses, but I think he had every opportunity to run better and just didn't have it in the lane. And Tom's Day Tie, I guess, is probably the most disappointing horse in the field. He just did no running whatsoever. So not a whole lot else to say about this one. I guess Maximum Security's being retired. I read that this morning, so we don't have to talk about him anymore. Thank goodness. It's yeah, that's it. I'll leave the rest of you to wrap this one up.
Yeah, we should probably mention that you brought up Improbable running well to be second. I would imagine that's going to be enough to secure him the Eclipse Award for older dirt male. There's just really nobody else in that division, especially given the results of the dirt mile and the sprint. Those horses aren't really up for winning that award. So given Improbable's compliments coming into this race, I would imagine that those two Eclipse Awards, 3-year-old and older male, were probably sorted out by this race. Moving on to the race right before the Classic, on the turf course, was the 1.5-mile Breeders' Cup Turf, and as with many races over this 2-day weekend, this one was dominated by the Europeans as Tarnawa, the 4-year-old filly, got the better of Magical, that excellent race mare who's been around for the past 3 or so seasons at this level, and they both ran nice races, but Tarnawa just asserted her superiority on this day. Not to say that Magical loses anything in defeat, but Tarnawa was coming into this race like she was in career form, and she took yet another step forward to win this one.
Yeah, she was awesome. I mean, there wasn't a whole lot of pace in this one. It was honest. I'll say that. I shouldn't say it's not like it was a slow pace type race, but it was just honest for that track. And she was able to mow them all down from behind. Made that big late run, was able to get up over Magical, who, as you say, it's just been a great story for a long time. And this was just the crowning race for the Euros, who just completely utterly dominated all of the turf races on Saturday after not getting any on Friday. But I think it's something we've all talked about for a long time. They're just better than us on this surface. So not a huge surprise. Tarnawa got a 131 TimeformUS speed figure, so even a point better than Authentic got in the Classic, and just a really top filly. And I hope she comes back as a 5-year-old mare. I haven't read what the plans are, but she's certainly the sky's the limit with her.
Yeah, the Europeans finished 1, 2, 4, 5 in this race, and just give a quick shout out to Channelmaker, who did get in there for the U.S. to be third, and I think just confirmed what we were saying before the race, that he had really found his form late in this 2020 season. He's responded so well to being ridden as a front runner, and he ran an excellent race. I mean, another huge speed figure out of him. He's just attained a level of consistency that really eluded him for all of his career leading up to now. There was no way that he was going to kick for home with those top Euros, Magical and Tarnawa, but I thought he put in a really nice performance to be third.
Yeah, he did. He got a 129 TimeformUS speed figure, which was kind of sandwiched by his prior 2 wins, 128 and a 130. And I mean, that's grade 1 horse for sure. I haven't taken the time to actually sort things out and how I would see my Eclipse voting yet for this category, but he's certainly got to be one of the strong contenders.
Oh, for sure. He's got those 2 Grade 1 victories and this performance, so I would imagine he's one of the leading contenders for that award, especially given the way the other turf races played out on this card. Moving backwards in time, let's next talk about the Breeders' Cup Distaff, where no surprise, Monomoy Girl able to repeat in this race, adding this 2020 distaff to her 2018 victory after missing last season. And there's really just not a whole lot left to say about this mare. She's just a picture of consistency. She's not always the flashiest horse. She doesn't win by gigantic margins or do it in particularly impressive fashion, but she just grinds away these victories, gets it done, and always shows up.
Yeah, she's fabulous. I think I tweeted after the race, well, it's pretty obvious she's going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer. I mean, she's just awesome. She doesn't always run the hugest speed figures, but we talked about her a lot this year as she came back in May with a so-so speed figure, but she just kind of worked her way up. She ran a 123 on this day, which matches her career best, which she had run a couple times before. And she did it while wide on both turns. And you know, I mean, granted, she did get a bit of a break when Swiss Skydiver had a bad break, but who knows? I don't know that Swiss Skydiver was beating her anyway. Maybe she was. It's really hard to say, but I don't want to take anything away from Monomoy Girl. Valiance continued her good form to run second. She actually got a 120, which kind of backed up her previous win where she got a 122 and over the same track in the Spinster. And I don't want to totally discount Swiss Skydiver. I actually thought she ran a really nice race given the break. When they turned for home, she actually made a move up inside and got really close into contention. And just I think that move took a little bit out of her, but she certainly lost nothing in defeat for me.
No, it was sort of the matchup that never was. I mean, if you know the way that Swiss Skydiver runs when she's successful, after she stumbled at the start like that and was so far back in the early go, I mean, you kind of knew her race was over. And unless the race completely fell apart, which it didn't appear that it was going to, she was not going to have a chance in here. And you know, this was a 2-horse race coming in, and once you took out that main rival, once she was prevented from running her top race, really, Monomoy Girl was just supposed to beat this field, and she did. And as you said, she's never a horse that runs particularly fast speed figures, and I think because of that, my praise of her has always been a little bit muted, and I think you feel the same way. But you go back and you look at her record and her accomplishments, and having crossed the wire first in 14 of 15 career starts, just that one neck loss when she was a 2-year-old, and that other time being taken down in the cotillion, rightfully so, against Midnight Bisou, who was no slouch either. I mean, she's just compiled an amazing record, and as you said, that's Hall of Fame worthy, and apparently we might still see her again because she sold at the Keeneland sale, and they're saying maybe they'll go for a 6-year-old campaign, so that would be a real treat.
Yeah, I was going to say this might have been the second most exciting thing she was a part of. Is I'm not one that's big on watching sales, but I did watch her, and watching that price skyrocket to $9.5 million was just something to see. And when I saw that, my first thought was they must be planning on bringing her back because that seemed like an awful lot of money just to be a broodmare. But she's one who could certainly rack up a lot of money on the track, and that's one good thing about the filly and mare division is since they can only have one foal a year, is if they're at the top of the division, they can make more money still racing. So hopefully we see her again next year. The one other horse I do want to mention is Harvest Moon, who came in undefeated on the dirt. Wound up finishing 4th after being part of that contested pace, but I actually thought she ran really well also. She got a 122 TimeformUS, was second best in the field. And if you look where the other pace setters finished, Ollie's Candy and Lady Kate, they were well back in the field. So I thought it was a really good effort by her, and I hope she's one that we get to see more of in 2021.
No, that's a good point, because the pace of this race, I know none of the fractions are color-coded red, but the pace of this race was pretty honest, and you saw that the second and third place finishers both closed from back in the pack, so that's a good mention by you for Harvest Moon, because she did run very well within the context of the race. Moving on back to the turf, to the Breeders' Cup Mile, and yet another one that was just dominated by the Europeans, or specifically dominated by the Irish contingent, Aidan O'Brien's to be specific, because He sent out the top 3 finishers in this race. That is just some accomplishment in a 14-horse field to have your 3 horses complete the trifecta and do so at some massive prices. Order of Australia obviously drawing in off the also eligible list to win this one at 73-1. I mean, this one was hard to predict, but you can't deny that these 3 horses ran excellent races.
They did. Now, granted, I will say this was not a strong race for a Breeders' Cup Mile. The winner only got a 122 TimeformUS speed figure, which is even pushing a grade 2. I would say that's what happens when you get this kind of result with a 73-1 shot winning. It usually means a lot of horses didn't particularly show up and run their race, and you know, when that happens, it's ripe for an upset, and that's exactly what we got. Not a whole lot I can add to this race. I certainly couldn't have come up with Order of Australia. I don't think. If somebody did, I'd love to hear the story because he wasn't for me. But if you did, hats off to you. Even Circus Maximus came in with not great form at all. So this race was a complete puzzle to me. I wasn't particularly enthralled with the Americans either. But these are far from the Euros I would have picked to win this race.
Yeah, I felt the same way. It was kind of a pitiful showing by the American runners. I mean, they just didn't really put forth their A efforts. And as you said, the Europeans that you expected to do well, they couldn't really show up on the day. I mean, I thought Kamiko, who I liked quite a bit in here, was getting a perfect trip in the pocket around both turns, saving all that ground, and he just had nothing in the stretch. I mean, he never even got by the pace setter Halliday, who held on for 6th. I don't have a whole lot to say about this one. As you said, when a big long shot wins, often it means that others didn't show up, and that certainly seems like that's what happened in this Breeders' Cup Mile.
Yeah, the only other point I want to make is that those top 3 all did get Lasix, and that's something I always look at. I know it's kind of a subject a lot of people don't like to talk about, and on the rare occasion a Euro ships over and wins without Lasix, but for the most part, those that don't get it usually underperform, and those that do seem to outperform their past performances. So just something to keep an eye on in the future. It's not 100% as nothing is, but I think it's something that people should look at when they handicap these races.
I should also say something that I had been mentioning before the race was that Aidan O'Brien, for all of his past success in the United States, had been coming into this with quite a losing streak. I think he had sent out something like 56 or 57 straight losers in the U.S. since 2018 before this Breeders' Cup Mile, and I think this is how you want to end a losing streak, by sending out the top 3 finishers in a Grade 1 race.
Yeah, it's one of those where now when you look up his ROI for his last 70 starters, it's going to look just fine. So, one of those rare fluky things you get where, I didn't put a whole lot of stock into that winning streak or losing streak. I think we had talked about it. And you kind of said similar, where he didn't often send his best horses over here. But his horses ran pretty well on the weekend. Even outside this race, this was the only one he won. But he had some other decent finishes as well.
No, I completely agree with that, especially in the 2-year-old races, which we'll get to. He had some horses that really performed well to pick up pieces. First, though, let's go back to the dirt and talk about the Breeders' Cup Sprint. This one, we had mentioned coming in that this was not the cream of the crop in terms of the best sprinters that we've seen over the past number of years. Certainly a far cry from the field that we saw assembled in this race in 2019 when Mitoli won. And I think a lot of horses just maybe didn't show up, because you could talk a little bit about the speed figure and how Whitmore, the winner of this race, ran considerably slower than another 6-furlong race on this card, which we'll get to a little bit later. But those behind him, they also regressed. And I mean, you could question whether maybe the track changed and that caused it, but I tend to believe that this just wasn't that strong of a field.
No, this was a race I handicapped for Gino Baccola on his podcast that he does. And I'll be the first to admit I didn't come close because I didn't like Whitmore. But the one thing I talked about was how weak of a sprint this was. The race rating coming into the race at TimeformUS, I think, was in the low 120s. And that was before the scratch of Vekoma. Without him, I'm sure it probably dropped a little bit down below 120. And that's exactly what we got with Whitmore winning the race. He got a 119 TimeformUS speed figure. CZ Rocket ran in second, got a 116, which is basically what has been running on his best days. So I personally didn't have a huge issue with the speed figures. I think the real no-show in here was Yapone, who I'm not sure what happened to him. He looked a little sluggish out of the gate. Tried to get up into the race and never really did. I think he got as close as fourth, but never up with the leaders, and just was disappointing as a surprisingly 6-5 favorite for me. But once Vekoma scratched it, it was just the open race, especially if you didn't think Yalpine, who I thought he would run well, but once he didn't show up, I mean, anything could happen. And the one thing I will say is, if somebody had to win, I would love to see it be Whitmore. He's such a cool horse. I've seen run many times in person. I think this was his fourth Breeders' Cup. He's hit the board in this race a couple times, so good to see him for him and his connections to get the big win.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that Yopom was such a heavy favorite in this race was because he was lightly raced coming in, and at least there was the possibility, or so it seemed, that he could take that next step forward and ascend to a level that these others had many chances to achieve and failed. And obviously that didn't happen. Breaking a half step slowly certainly didn't help, especially with that Japanese horse basically getting ridden like it was a quarter horse race. And he just could never get anywhere near the front, and his race was over at that point. And we should mention, Irad Ortiz gave Whitmore one of the rides of the weekend, getting this horse down to the inside, saving ground, seamlessly working him off the rail and upper stretch to find that clear path to the wire. He was much the best on the day, but he got the ride to help get him there.
Yeah, I know Irad gets a lot of flack on social media, but he's the best rider out there for my money. He has his weaknesses like everybody else. I don't particularly think he's great on a speed horse, but when you put him on a horse like this in a race where the pace is a little bit quick for the horses, and he's going to save ground and find a spot. And as you say, this was just a fabulous ride.
And this is one of those where I guess we'll talk about it a little bit more in the coming weeks, but I mean, I really don't know who the champion sprinter is. I guess you could give it to Whitmore. I mean, he's got this victory on his resume now, and that trumps really everything else that anybody's done this year. But he wouldn't be the most dominant champion that we've seen in this division, to say the least. I don't know if there are any races out there that can really change things between now and the Eclipse Award voting. I mean, I know there's also Vekoma, who won races going a little farther than this, and maybe we'll see him come back in a race like the Cigar Mile. Not that that necessarily counts towards the sprint division, but that's one of those Eclipse Awards that I think is a little up in the air.
Yeah, I guess you missed it. Vekoma was actually retired.
I did miss that.
Yeah, that came out a couple days ago. Monday. It was probably yesterday that I saw it. But he's not going to be running. Maybe Gamine, who we're going to talk about later, she could count as a sprinter, I guess, particularly if she runs again and wins with that race out in Southern California late in the year. But it's one I'm going to have to pull up all the PPs before figuring out who I'm going to vote for, because there's so many directions you could go probably. I'm probably forgetting a few things. It's just been such a wide open division that it's hard for me to say right now.
Yeah, as Eclipse Award voters, we should know this, but I can't remember if they actually added those designations, male sprinter and female sprinter. I know that they did that in the dirt male category. You can't vote for a champion dirt horse as a female. I forget if that's sprinter too. It might not be, but I've got to look that up before I formulate my Eclipse Award opinions.
Luckily, they lay that all out for us when they send the ballot, so we don't have to think too much.
Moving on to the filly and mare turf, and another race that was won by Europeans, as were, I think, all the Breeders' Cup races on the turf on Saturday at Keeneland. And this time it was the French Invader, Audaria, who got the job done. And a lot like Tarnawa in the turf, she was a horse that was coming in the best form of her career, and she beat some very good Americans. Though in this one, the Americans did show up. They just got beaten by a superior horse who was doing very well.
Yeah, it was a good effort. As you're right, they did win all the races, and she got a great ride in here. I gotta admit, I wasn't all that familiar with some of the riders who were winning these races, but I was very impressed by the colony that was sent over. I did feel bad for the French rider whose name's escaping me, who was supposed to ride, I think it was 3 of these winners. but came down with COVID and wasn't able to make the trip. But good effort here. I thought obviously the winner ran well. I thought Rushing Fall actually ran just as well, tracking that fast pace, solid pace. I shouldn't say fast, but at a distance it is probably really pushing her limit. She really fought to the wire and just proved what a top class mare she's been throughout her career. I imagine she's one destined for the Hall of Fame as well. And there were a couple others I thought ran well also. Harvey's Little Goyle, the 3-year-old, actually took another step forward and just ran a huge race. And I think we're going to see her stick on turf after this one, because we've talked about her a lot as she went back and forth. But I think she's clearly shown this as her best surface. With this effort, she actually got a 125. And Lady Prancelot in fourth was actually my crazy long shot in here. I just had a feeling she would finally get some pace to run into, which she never got in California. And while she wasn't good enough to catch the top 3, I thought she ran very well also. But just shows what can happen when in races with big fields that actually get pace compared to our typical stakes that we see, unfortunately, with smaller fields and not a lot of pace.
Yeah, I have to say, I was extremely impressed by Pierre-Charles Boudot, the rider of this horse, as well as Order of Australia and the Breeders' Cup Mile. Watch the ride that he gives Audaria in the first quarter mile of this race, because she breaks from post 11 and he just is intent on getting her over to the rail, and he doesn't bowl his way down there. He does it with a great deal of finesse, but he just finds the spots to tuck in behind horses one by one until he gets all the way down to the inside. He just rode the rail the rest of the way from that point, got off it when he needed to go around that tiring Cayenne Pepper, who made that crazy early move to the front down the straight for the first time. And he was able to get her into the clear with enough time and win. It's a toss-up for me between Irad Ortiz's ride on Whitmore in the sprint and this for ride of the weekend. I'd probably give it to Pierre-Charles Boudot, because in a 2-turn race with 14 horses, it's much more difficult to work out a perfect trip than it is going 6 furlongs. And I thought this was just a real masterclass on the turf at Keeneland.
And yeah, it's interesting to note both the winners of the turf and this race came out of that same race on Arc Day, the one for Fillies and Mares, the Prix de l'Opera. And so, I mean, if you went into the class to the turf without realizing that, it was probably a pretty good angle to see how well this one had run when Turnabo was entering the gate for the turf.
Moving on to the early part of the day at Keeneland, where they ran the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile, a barely run mile distance at Keeneland with that very short run into the first turn and that short stretch drive. And Craig, you could talk a little bit about the pace of this race, because I know this is one where the posted fractions didn't quite match up with Trackus as well as some of the other races on the day. Obviously, the fractions appeared to be very fast, and Nick's Go got to the front and just kept on running. This is a horse who we had talked about a bit before because of his gigantic speed figures earlier in this year coming into this race, had never really done it against top-level competition, but he was able to translate those fast figures into this race. And Brad Cox, it just seems like all of his runners show up on these big days. I don't know how he does it. Other trainers, it seems like it's a bit more of a coin flip whether their horses can translate their prior good form to these big days. But Brad Cox, it just seems like all of his runners show up, and this one certainly did.
He did, and I definitely think the course setup helped him, as you alluded to. But this is at the Keeneland Mile. They use a short stretch, but they also use a really long run up. I think it was listed this day as 190 feet. So timing the race, I didn't really have any problem with the teletimer times. I thought they were fine. It's just they were enhanced quite a bit because of that long run up. And when you get really fast horses on what was a fast track, that's what's going to happen. Nick's Go came in with clearly the best last race speed figure. Complexity had the second best, a good length and a half behind him. And he was able to use that speed to his advantage, open up on the field, turning for home, and just nobody could catch him. And to be honest, nobody was really making up any ground. So he was clearly the best horse in the race. He got a 129 TimeformUS speed figure on this day. I should mention it as a speed figure maker because of that long run up. I did adjust this down a little bit compared to the other routes. That's something that sometimes you have to do at Keeneland, but it's not something you always have to do. If the horse is just kind of lollygagging flag out of the gate and don't take advantage of that long run up, sometimes it doesn't matter. But when they're gunned out of there like Nick Sko was, intent on getting the lead, it definitely makes a difference. So if I use my conventional speed charts, this figure could have been a good 5 or 6 points higher, but I don't think that was the way to go. The other horses in behind all kind of fit into what they'd been running before with this. So I don't have any issues with the speed figure. It's not one I even think I would have to go back and check. Should mention the 3-year-old Jesus' team had a huge race to be second in here. I do think he kind of sucked up into that spot after Complexity chased the winner. Complexity actually got a little bit of a better figure than those two. He got a 125 running fourth compared to a 121 and a 123 for the 2-3 finishers. But just a really good effort from the winner, and curious to see where they go with him. I hope he shows up next year. There's no reason for me to think he can't go further. I don't think the mile's the limit, especially seeing how he ran this race.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see just whether they can keep this horse on the track, because he's had some layoffs in his career, and I know it's been tough to keep him in form, to keep him consistent, and just to keep him around. So we'll see what they're able to do with him, whether he stays in training or not. But obviously, when he's in form, he's pretty darn good. And yeah, I never really know what to make of the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile and what it really means in the grand scheme of things with regard to year-end awards, or really how it stacks up with other Grade 1 races, because for a lot of these horses, it seems like it's almost a consolation prize. A lot of horses wind up running in here because they just weren't quite good enough to make it to the Classic or the Sprint. So obviously Nick Sko is a really talented horse. I just don't want to go overboard with praising him on the same level as some of the other Breeders' Cup winners that we saw this weekend.
Yeah, I definitely have no problem with that. And as usual, we have to wait and see how it shakes out and who's actually left. I do think this Breeders' Cup showed that the 3-year-old division was pretty darn strong this year. We saw obviously the winner in the Classic. We had the runner up here, and we have some horses coming back. I see Charlatan's been working. So it's a strong crop looking forward to next year.
Now, the Europeans were so dominant on this Saturday card that they even were able to win the turf sprint, I believe, for the first time ever. And Glass Slippers, who I've got to say, I mean, she was no slouch coming into this race. She's regarded as one of the best sprinters in Europe, probably second only to Batoche. And she showed up here, really handled the American tight turns better than a lot of the American horses did, as she skimmed the rail and got this victory. There were some rough trips in behind her, though, and I think that might have played into the result.
Yeah, it did. She got a good trip, but it's just it's another one of those things I was probably guilty of lazy handicapping, where I just said, it's a Euro, she can't win, and I tossed her. But as you say, she's one of the better Euro sprinters that we have, and probably the best one on accomplishments that's ever been sent over here for a race like this. So not a huge surprise. I mean, I think she only went off about 10-1. She got a 120 TimeformUS speed figure for the win, which matched her Timeform rating in her last race at Longchamp, where she was beaten just a neck, also on Arc Day in that big Group 1 sprint that they run. So really good effort from her. I'll be honest, I haven't taken the time to actually go through the trips in this one. I have no doubt that there were many of them. Just watching the race, there was a lot of congestion, really tightly bunched. So I'll let you expand on that a little bit.
I mean, I think that the big one that most people were talking about after the race was with Imprimis, who looked like he might have been in position to win the race at the top of the stretch and was going for the same hole as Glass Slippers. And Irad Ortiz made a split-second decision to try to go outside, I think right inside of Leinster, whereas, forgive me, I'm forgetting the first name of the rider on Glass Slippers, Eves, he made the decision to go inside and was able to get through that hole. And basically what happened with Imprimis is he got sandwiched in between Glass Slippers and Leinster and just kind of was ridden right into the back of a tiring horse. And it's I mean, he was lucky not to go down because it looked like he was about to clip heels. And you see that he finished 13th. It was a situation where that bit of trouble might have been the difference between him finishing 13th and first. So just a really unlucky run for Imprimis, who deserved a lot better on the day. But I mean, it's hard to blame Arad Ortiz. He was trying to do the right thing. It just, in these turf sprints, you got to make these decisions so fast. And sometimes you make the wrong one and the consequences are pretty severe.
Yeah, it's hard for me to fault the jockey in a spot like that. It's Tom Eves, by the way. I don't know why I remember that, but I think I remember seeing him getting interviewed after the race, and this was another of those great rides I was talking about by a jockey I wasn't particularly familiar with. But as you said, it easily could have went the other way for Irad. It just didn't work out in this spot. That one was the one I definitely noticed.
And let's complete the Breeders' Cup Saturday action by discussing the first race on that card for the Breeders' Cup series. That's the filly and mare sprint. And this might have been the most impressive performance that we saw on Saturday, as it looked like a two-horse race coming in between Gamine and Serengeti Empress, and it certainly played out that way in the early portion of the race, as Luis Saez was intent on getting ahead of ahead of Gamine in the first quarter mile, sending Serengeti Empress to the lead. But Gamine got outside, stalked her the entire way, applied pressure, and really just broke her, and then went on to an extremely impressive victory. I mean, this filly, she's just unbeatable in one-turn races.
Yeah, that was quite the performance. I wasn't as high on her as some others were, but the bettors got this one right. There's a pretty big discrepancy between even money and 3-1, and she made it look like stealing money how easily she won, drawing away, and no real excuses for anybody in here. The pace was quick, so it didn't it didn't damage the back runners, the closers at all in here, and none of them could catch these top two. Bell's the one got closest, nearly nabbing second from Serengeti Empress late, but Gamine, it was just the tour de force. She got a 1:33 TimeformUS speed figure on the day, the fastest of all the Breeders' Cup races that we're going to talk about. So just a huge effort. I don't know what they're going to do with her going forward, but one turn seems to be the way to go because, I mean, nobody seems to be able to even come in the same area code as her.
Yeah, she's just brilliantly fast, especially over that 7 furlong distance. That really seems to be right in the sweet spot for her. She can get the mile too. But I agree, those one-turn races are where you want to keep her in the future. And she's one of these horses where, we talk about it a lot when we're handicapping. She had gotten some gigantic final time-based numbers, and it's one of the reasons that I know you don't look at the buyers too much, but she had gotten some gigantic buyer speed figures, which are just based on final time, and her TimeformUS speed figures didn't really single her out as quite as the same standout, because she had been involved in a lot of slow-paced races where she was just superior to her rivals. Now, there are the rare horses that can run just as fast in slow paces as they can in fast paces, but it really remains to be seen until those horses get tested whether or not they could do that. And she clearly is one of those very special horses that can go fast early and just keep running and achieve those gigantic speed figures. And she did it again here because Serengeti Empress, she ran her race. She was just second best.
Yeah, she sure did without Gamine. I mean, I think she wins the race easy. I was pretty amazed she was able to hang on for second because she really fought as long and as hard as she could and just kind of was on fumes at the wire. But big effort from her. She got a 128 speed figure from us, which fits with the 130 and 127 she had run last time. But as you say, Gamine just... Sometimes you just don't know with these horses when they don't have to go fast. You don't know what they have in the tank, but Gamine clearly had plenty. And I'm not one of these. I'm not going to get too hung up on the 2 DQs or the 2 drug positives that she's had because that just isn't, they're not performance enhancers for me. Whatever issues she had, she needed some painkillers. I don't think it detracts from this performance at all. I know I'll probably get some heat for that, but it's just the way I see it. She's a fabulous filly. She's super fast, and I don't think there's anything artificial about this win at all.
Yeah, it's, I don't really have a whole lot to add to that. It's not something that you can really, it's a lose-lose situation even talking about it, because we don't have all the facts. Really, nobody has all the facts, at least not those in the public, which I consider us to be. And as you said, the drug positives that came back were not for performance-enhancing drugs per se, at least not in the levels that were found in her system. And I mean, you say what you will about Bob Baffert and how he gets his horses to perform, but I mean, what's been reported is not the smoking gun I think that a lot of people want it to be, and we'll just leave it at that. Before we move on to the Friday card, let's discuss one more race from Saturday. That was the first race of the Breeders' Cup card, the Perryville going 6 furlongs for the 3-year-olds, and this is one I think that if people got up early enough to see it, had them talking for the rest of the afternoon, as Nashville, who was briefly considered for the Breeders' Cup Sprint, they ultimately decided to take the path of least resistance and go in this race where he was, I think, probably the 1-20 favorite. He easily beat this field. The speed figure came back gigantic. I mean, obviously he broke the track record by, I think, over half a second, and that typically will result in a very high speed figure. But talk about a little this race and if you had any reservations about giving him this high of a number.
Honestly, I did not. The races on Friday and the races on Saturday, for me, looked about as easy as could be for speed figures, especially on dirt. They all lined up for me, given the projections I used from previous races. So I didn't have a problem with it. I was a bit surprised when I saw the buyer speed figures come out, and I always wind up getting tagged in tweets or people text me. And frankly, it's really hard for me to say because I don't know what the horses had coming in on buyer speed figures. I hadn't looked at them before. I heard Andy's explanation on Steve Bick's show, and you know what? That's fine. That's what you're going to get with speed figures like ours and buyers. There is some subjectivity that goes into it. Sometimes I get them wrong. Sometimes he gets them wrong. It's just part of the process. We do the best we can, and you hope that you got them right, because we both realize that there's people betting a lot of money on these figures, and we're affecting how people play the races. So we do the best we can, but we're not always going to agree, and we clearly disagreed here. I think it was just a fabulous performance. I didn't find any reason to break it out. I know the second place finisher got a big jump up, but to me, that's not a surprise, and not a big reason for me to break out figures, because the other horses in the field, mostly ran to the figures they've been running with our pace adjusted numbers. So I didn't really have a problem with the 134. And if you ask me, I mean, I kept saying it going into the race. I think they made a big mistake by running him in this race, because I think he would have blitzed the sprint. He would have outrun the Japanese horse based on speed pace figures. And certainly to the wire, I just don't think anybody could have touched him. But that's a decision not for me. Like I had mentioned on that podcast with Gino Bacola, I said I would have loved to have heard the discussion going on between the owners, because I think there's different ownership groups. If I was in the Nashville group and they tried to talk me into running in the Perryville instead of the BC Sprint, I would have been fuming mad. So I would love to have been a fly on the wall to hear that one, because I think he's as good a sprinter as we've seen all year long, for sure. He's up there with a horse like Matoli, who was running and didn't even run this fast early on. So I think he's the real deal. I'm looking forward to see where he goes from here. And that said, I'll certainly monitor the speed figures. But the last thing I'll say on that is Andy Beyer gets way more flack than I ever would when he makes this kind of decision. But I would say keep in mind that it is subjective. If you want some figures that don't use any subjectivity, they're out there, but they're just not as good. I'm not going to pick on people and point out some examples. You can go look up the best speed figures on the year at some of the various sites that use computer generated figures. And frankly, they're kind of funny to look at. So I think you're better off getting that human intervention to actually look at it and see what happened. And it is possible, as Andy said, maybe the track was faster for the first race and I'm wrong here, and we'll see going forward, or maybe we won't. Sometimes these things just remain an enigma that you don't really ever find out the answer.
Yeah, and when I think you did mention, I'll just repeat though, Nashville got a 134 TimeformUS speed figure for this race. That follows up the 130 that he got for his victory at Keeneland prior to this in M1X Allowance Company a month earlier. And I think that makes him the fastest horse in the country right now. I don't think I've seen a speed figure faster than 134 this entire year, Craig. You can remind me if I'm wrong about that. But I mean, he's just he's a real special talent, and you see him break from the gate, as you were alluding to. He's just so quick off the blocks, and he just has this natural early speed that Ricardo Santana just doesn't even have to ask him for. It's like he's out for a morning canter, and he's opening up 5 or 6 lengths on these field of stakes level sprinters going 6 furlongs. It's really something to behold. And I mean, some people were saying, oh, he could have run faster if he had really been put to the whip in the lane. With a horse like this, I don't really buy into that because he's running all out without being asked. I don't think if Ricardo Santana was whipping and driving him, we'd see him run like a 145. That's just not how these things work. When you've got a horse that's this naturally aggressive, sometimes the rider is just along for the journey. He doesn't really have to ask the horse all out. I think people make way too much of that in riders' body language with horses like this. And you can't always lay one race right on top of the other to say that, oh, the second place finisher who got a 122, maybe he should have been in the Breeders' Cup Sprint and he would have won that race because you assigned him a higher number than Whitmore. I mean, the horses in the Breeders' Cup Sprint obviously had to deal with 13 other runners and a lot of traffic trouble, and that can sometimes lead to lower speed figures than horses that basically get totally clean trips, unencumbered runs, which is what all of the horses in this Perryville got. So, I mean, you can't always make race-to-race comparisons of speed figures like this and say one necessarily would have won the other race. But I'm never going to knock you saying that the horse got the number that he earned when the track doesn't change. And I don't think you said this explicitly, but it was your view that the track didn't change really at all on Saturday, because I think you used pretty much the same variant for the entire day. And I'm never going to criticize that because the horses ran the numbers that they ran relative to each other. And we'll see if that proves out in the future. But I kind of agree that you shouldn't be monkeying around and saying otherwise when the evidence doesn't necessarily point to that.
Yeah, I'm one that when I have doubt, I go with the clock. If it's a cloudy situation for me and the timer worked, which as we see isn't always going to happen, but normally you can trust it, I'm going to go with the clock when it's just something I can't decide. And unless the figure evidence, when I look at my worksheet, just points that makes it blatantly obvious that the track was different. Usually that involves a couple races, like we'll see it in mid-card, where there's just a big change of 15 points for couple races before, and then you draw a line and the races after are totally different. And personally, I just didn't see that here. Maybe if I get a chance, I'll post what my worksheet actually looked like so people can see why it was such an easy decision for me. It might be a little hard to read, so it'll take some explaining. Not hard to read, but for people to understand. But I think it could be illuminating. So that said, before we move on to Friday racing, I'd like to get your take on the track this weekend and if you think there was a track bias, because that was a huge point of discussion on social media and on some message boards that I'm on. And personally, I didn't see it. I mean, I think it's a track where having speed certainly was a good thing, but I don't think it was dictating the results. But maybe you saw it differently?
I think whenever you get a racetrack that's playing as fast as Keeneland was on Friday and Saturday, and I'll just kind of diverge here for a second into a tangent. I don't understand why racetracks feel the need to soup up these tracks to be faster than they've ever been before on big race days like this. I don't get the obsession with track records and track maintenance crews deciding that they want to see a ton of track records on a given weekend. It doesn't make the speed figures higher. It just doesn't make any sense to me. And it arguably creates a more dangerous situation for the horses and riders. So I think that's just a really bad move by track maintenance crews. I know not all of it is down to them. And sometimes in the middle of summer, you have no choice but to let the sun bake the surfaces. That was not the case at Keeneland this weekend. They obviously maintained this track to be different than it was at the fall meet in October. So I don't know why they do that. to me, there's no benefit in doing it, and there's arguably downside in doing it. And one of the consequences of very, very fast racetracks is that they can just naturally be a little more speed favoring because horses just bounce over them at very fast paces. And that too could be a reason why you saw Nashville run so fast, because fast racetracks tend to carry along frontrunners a little bit. And that might have been the case with Nashville. When you start out going so fast and you're on a surface that's not making you exert a whole lot of energy going fast fractions, you can just kind of ride that to the finish and not taper off the same way that you would over a deeper, tiring track. And I think we saw that as opposed to a path bias. I didn't really see the rail being any kind of advantage on either of these days. I know there was some talk of that early on when Highly Motivated was so impressive winning that first race on Friday, that 2-year-old for Chad Brown, but I just think that's a really good horse who was much the best in that race. But after that, I did not see a real path bias. I just think there might have been a slight speed favoring situation due to how fast the track was.
Yeah, I think you said it perfectly. It was definitely a fast track, and no doubt it was a different surface than we saw in the fall. I put a couple things on Twitter out there about how it changed, and this track was playing much more like the track we saw this summer, even a little bit faster than that, which you could blame on the weather, but you couldn't do it here. So I do think there was some intention to have this fast track, and I don't really understand it, but as you said, a fast track doesn't necessarily mean a biased track. It does give a little bit of advantage to the horses up front because they're just not going to get as tired. You don't get as tired running 1 minute and 8 seconds as you would get running 1 minute and 11 seconds. It's just the way it works. And personally, I hope by the next time they get it more right. I think last year was a bit too slow on the other side at Santa Anita, where we saw a completely different, almost the exact opposite of this kind of track where a lot of horses didn't handle it. So personally, I'd like to see something a little bit more in the middle, but as far as our TimeformUS ratings go, there's no color code for either Friday or Saturday because horses were winning from off the pace, on the pace. We don't look at inside and outside, but we saw plenty of horses inside and plenty of horses outside run just fine. So like you said, it did aid front runners a little bit, but not enough to get any color coding from us.
And I think that's a good segue into the next race we're going to talk about, which is the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, the feature race on the Friday card, because a lot of the results that we saw, I think, were dictated by the pace of these races. When we saw Authentic wire the field in the Classic, that was not necessarily a speed-favoring situation. They just let him get away with extremely soft fractions for horses at that level. Well, we saw the opposite situation in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile, and we saw a different result as they went extremely fast through that first half mile. There were some horses in this race that it seems like they were just in there to beat Jackie's Warrior. I mean, one in particular, Dreamer's Disease, who was going out for the same connections as Keep Me in Mind. Both of them long shots in this field, but long shots with different styles. It kind of seemed like he was in this race just to beat the favorite, and that's legal. You can do that, but it definitely hindered Jackie's Warrior. And Essential Quality, I think, got the right kind of trip that you want to get in these races, where Luis Saez had him off the pace, but had him outside and in the clear, and he was just able to make a long, sustained, unencumbered run into the race, not having to weave through traffic. And in races that are bound to collapse, I think that's the kind of trip that you want to get, and he was able to ride that trip to victory.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt. Essential Quality is a really good 2-year-old. He got a 112 TimeformUS speed figure for the win. Not surprisingly, a career best. He's a horse who's looked good all 3 times out, but I definitely think he got a great setup in here. You can just look at where the top 5 finishers were early, and they were all well back except for Jackie's Warrior, the favorite, who I thought ran just as well. He actually got a 112 back and forth. That's how hot the pace was. We have the top 2 fractions coded in red. And just kind of a refresher for people who don't know or maybe don't use us regularly, that isn't just based on the raw fractions. It's based on a percentage of what the fraction was of the final time. So we look at This race finished in 1:42.09. I kind of look at all the races that have been run at Keeneland at this distance and predict what the winner generally runs early, and these were just much, much faster. So clearly a race that's set up for closers. I'm certainly not ready to write off Jackie's Warrior off this effort. I thought he ran really well, but so did some others in here. Even the runner-up, Hot Rod Charlie, got a 112, and I think he was 90-something to 1 in this race. So it was a decent enough juvenile. The speed figure was probably aided by the really fast pace. The faster the pace is, the more likely you are to run a good final time. So I think that was part of it. But I'm not going to put a whole lot of results into the finishing positions here because I think the trips had a lot to do with it.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And it might just turn out that Jackie's Warrior is not the kind of horse that really wants to go 2 turns. He might just be like Gamine. He might be a 1-turn specialist that's best between 7 furlongs and a mile, and that would be just fine. But I don't think that's the entire reason why he lost this race. He was involved at an extremely fast pace where all of the other pace players finished at least 6.5 lengths behind him, most of them a lot farther behind him than that. So I think he did run very well within the context of the race. You just had some horses that were closing from farther back in the pack that were able to get past him in the lane. And, I'm being maybe a little less complimentary of Essential Quality than some other people. Essential Quality is an undefeated colt. He's obviously improving quickly. He's shown a lot of promise. He hasn't, to me, yet shown that he has some significant advantage over his rivals. He has not run a speed figure that really makes him a standout for me among this division yet. We'll see what he does in the future. Obviously, there's more room for improvement for him down the line, but he got the job done in this race. And I thought the others that you mentioned ran well too. Hot Rod Charlie, he's that younger half-brother to Mitoli. He obviously ran well, making the first move before Essential Quality after Jackie's Warrior. He held on for second, and we'll just see how these horses develop in the future, because I think that's always the big question coming out of the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. Which of these horses will go on as 3-year-olds?
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree. We know very rarely do the horses out of this race actually go on to be strong factors later on. Usually some horses we've never heard of wind up leading the division, but there are times it does, and I have no real knocks on Essential Quality. I would imagine he's locked up the Eclipse Award for 2-year-olds with this win. I doubt we'll see him again this year, but I think it's still a wide open division. I don't think this race told us a whole bunch.
Moving on to the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies Turf, we saw maybe the most dominant performance on the Friday card out of Aunt Pearl, who was coming in again for the Brad Cox stable, who I think won 4 Breeders' Cup races over the 2 days. She had come in off 2 impressive victories and took a huge step forward to beat this much tougher field, doing it in the exact same way, sending to the front, getting an alert start, and just never looking back.
Yeah, this one surprised me. I mean, she had obviously been visually impressive. There were some questions about the times of her races, which made the figures tough, just because like the last one at Keeneland, they used a completely new, very long run up that we had never seen before. And it kind of played out through the fall meet. They kept doing that, but this horse did it again. So, I mean, she's obviously the real deal, and she actually got a huge speed figure for a 2-year-old filly. She got a 115 for the win. That was a little bit boosted because she went so fast early. Our final time was a 112, but just a really big effort from her. I can't even knock the others in here. I mean, it's not like she just inherited an easy lead. She blitzed them, went fast, and nobody could keep up. And to that point, nobody was even really gaining much at the end. I mean, the runner-up for Aidan O'Brien, Mother Earth, she ran okay. Miss Amulet ran okay as well. The Wesley Ward horse back and forth, Campanelli, did okay. But this was essentially a one-horse race once the gate popped. Nobody ever got within shouting distance.
And I'm going to put you on the spot here a little bit. Do you know if they use the same run-up for these 2 races, the Juvenile Turf and the Juvenile Fillies Turf, because obviously the pace of this race seemed so much faster, especially for that first quarter mile, than the Juvenile Turf, where we'll talk about in a little bit. They did not go very quickly up front, but Aunt Pearl, I mean, it wasn't just one of these where it looked to me like the run-up had something to do with it. I mean, she'd opened up, I think, like a 4-length advantage into the clubhouse turn. She was really moving in the opening part of this race.
Right. They had a run up of 55 feet for the boys and 92 for the girls. So it made a little bit of a difference, but not hugely. Once you get over a certain amount, uh, it's not usually a big effect on the final time. I mean, had one been 20 feet where they start timing the races before horses get a chance up to full speed, then it would have a much bigger effect. But that 40 feet, I should say it this way, 40 feet can be a big difference. But when you're talking about the difference between 55 and 92, it's not a huge difference.
It's just kind of amazing how much Ann Pearl really reminds you of Newspaper of Record, who came in with almost exactly the same credentials, a maiden victory and a graded stakes win in a prep race, and she went 3 for 3 in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies turf. They're by that same sire, Lope de Vega. They have the exact same running style. We'll see if this one goes on as a 3-year-old, because I know a lot of these precocious 2-year-olds don't always, and we've seen some progeny of Lope de Vega not go on when they get a little bit older. So we'll see, but she's obviously extremely impressive where she is right now.
Yeah, the other thing I'll mention, this course was rated good at Keeneland. I would say it was pretty close to firm given the times of the races that we got for these 2-year-olds. The track variant I used, it was pretty firm if you ask me. So I wouldn't say this was a track that had a whole bunch of give in it.
Moving on to the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies, this one on the dirt, going a mile on the 16th. And speed figure makers, they get a lot of flack sometimes, especially when people's visual impressions don't match what the numbers say. And I know you got a lot of questions, as did all speed figure makers, about Princess Noor coming into this race and how slow her figures looked and whether she could run faster when she was really put to the test. Well, we got the answer. Yes, she could run faster, but she ran faster and finished 5th in this race, and I think that just speaks to how much ground she had to make up on the other fillies in here who are already running faster races, and I guess it shouldn't have been a big surprise that the 2 horses coming out of the fastest prep race, the Frisette, finished 1-2 just in reverse order, and if you played that, you got back $24 for a $1 exacta.
Yeah, this was a solid race. As you said, Princess Noor, she did take a step forward, but it was such a big gap that it just wasn't enough. I thought she ran okay. The thing that's just surprised me is why you would take 9-5 on that proposition, as obviously a lot of people did, is I think she wound up going off the slight favorite in here. No doubt. I thought myself she was going to run a better race, but the question was how much better. And, sometimes if this horse was 8-1 or 10-1, I think that's a play you want to make because these are 2-year-olds and you're looking for a developing horse. But as a favorite, that's not something I want to see personally. But as you said, the 2 horses out in the New York race ran very well. The winner, Vequist, got a 110. Day Out of the Office got a 109. I wouldn't say she had much of an excuse. The pace was just moderate. And Vequist was just the better horse on this day. I think that second turn was probably more to her liking. If memory serves, I think she was favored pretty heavily over Day Out of the Office. Maybe you can correct me on that if I'm wrong in their prior matchup. And she just seemed to love that second turn and ran really well to get that 110.
Yeah, she got the distance, and she's a deserving champion that she's got this grade 1 to go along with her very impressive victory in the grade 1 spinaway at Saratoga. And she just was the one that took that step forward with the added ground, as you alluded to. The one thing I'll add to this race is I did think that Simply Ravishing got a little bit unlucky because she stumbled at the start and breaking from the rail. I know they had wanted to be aggressive with her, and that's just a tough break to not get that kind of trip and then have to adjust. And also coming to the top of the stretch, she got bounced around between horses, got in some traffic. She certainly should have been second in this race and arguably could have made it close had she gotten the right trip, but that's just how things work out sometimes, and we'll see what she can do next year as all of these horses progress to their 3-year-old seasons.
Yeah, she was the one trip horse that I saw in here. Unfortunately, I had a close eye on her because she's the one I bet. It didn't work out very well.
Same here. It's winding down. We're moving on to a couple more turf races on this Breeders' Cup Friday card. The juvenile turf going the mile for the 2-year-old colts and geldings. This one resulted in a pretty big upset as Fire at Will, who was coming off a grade 3 win in the Pilgrim, I mean, me included, a lot of us thought that he maybe was not the best horse coming out of that race. Little did we know is he was the one that took a big step forward and got the job done here. Though I think the real story of this race was the pace and how much it slowed down in the middle of the race, which allowed it to turn into a sprint to the wire. And he was just the horse that was in position to sprint home the fastest.
Yeah, he got a good trip inside. He was up close to the pace and was able to finish the quickest. As I said, he was kind of pulling away at the end. So I couldn't come up with this horse personally. He had won that race last time with only an 87 speed figure, but he jumped all the way up to a 112 here. I'm certainly going to go back and look at that Pilgrim, but I mean, the way Public Sector ran, I doubt it's anything was wrong with the speed figure so much as Fire as Will at Will just had a lot more in the tank and improved quite a bit to win here.
No, I remember you wrote me an email about that Pilgrim figure because it came back so much lower than the Miss Griot on the same card, or yeah, I think they were on the same card, and they had very different pace situations, and I kind of was on the fence about what to do, as were you. Maybe those two races should have been a little bit closer than I think the 20 points apart than they ended up being. Fire at Will obviously took a big step forward in this race, but even Public Sector, who got just not the right trip and finished far back, even he improved on his Pilgrim figure. So maybe that is a race to go back and look at because the third place finisher came back out of that race and won a stakes next time. So I guess those are the ones that maybe you do want to look at and revise, but I certainly still didn't see this kind of improvement coming out of the winner, Fire at Will. He's a horse who had a trip at his first start at Saratoga on the turf, then he won a dirt race, so I guess we didn't get a true line on his ability until this one, but just goes to show how much these two-year-olds can improve in a short amount of time. The one other horse that I want to mention out of this race that ran deceptively well, I think, is the runner-up Battleground. We talked about how some of Aidan O'Brien's horses ran well on this Friday card, and I think this is the one that I was really thinking about because he was really 3 to 4 wide around both turns. There was not a whole lot of running going on from the back of the pack, and he was certainly finishing the fastest of all the closers at the end of this race. He's a lightly raced horse, the son of Breeders' Cup Turf winner Found. He could have a big 3-year-old year for Aidan O'Brien if he stays healthy.
Yeah, I will mention, I think that Pilgrim and Miss Griot were run on back-to-back days, which is something that made it even tougher. And, not being on the same card, if I remember right, is what made it so tough, the big gap between them. So I'm certainly going to take a look at that when there's 2-year-old figures can be tough, particularly when there's hardly any other races run on the surface. And you just got to do the best you can with it. And that's what I did there. We'll see. I'll certainly tweet about it if I make any changes. I probably won't, to be honest, unless there's just overwhelming evidence otherwise. But it just shows that these 2-year-olds are tough. You can never be sure, especially on turf where they just don't run as much.
The final Breeders' Cup race that we'll talk about was the first one of the weekend. That was the Juvenile Turf Sprint, the one Grade 2 event on this Breeders' Cup weekend, going 5.5 furlongs on the turf for the 2-year-olds. And Golden Pal, who I know Wesley Ward had been touting all year as the best 2-year-old in his barn, well, he delivered on the big day, getting the job done here. He's a wickedly fast horse, and we saw that in the early going. He probably would have preferred if this race was 5 furlongs to 5.5, but he was still able to hold on to get the job done.
Yeah, it was kind of a weird race to watch as he broke so fast and was on that lead, and then he kind of got yanked back a little bit and everybody caught up, and then he pulled away again. And Cowan was actually really running late. He was a horse that broke not very good at all. Actually, Cowan broke okay. The third finisher is one who was coming late as well, who broke really bad. I got those mixed up watching live as well. For some reason, the 5 and 6 look really close to me, but Golden Pal's actually, he's obviously really good. I would say he's at the top of the division, but I don't know that juvenile turf sprinters can even be called a division. I was a little surprised the speed figure wasn't better. He only got a 105 for the win, but it's juvenile turf sprinters. I don't think they're the best horses in the division. Those ones try to go longer, and he's the best of this group. I just don't know what to make of this race at this point. I wasn't blown away by the speed figure. They're certainly going to develop some moving into the 3-year-old season, but we'll just wait and see where he shows up. They were already talking about shipping him over to Ascot, so who knows what'll become of Golden Pal.
Yeah, Wesley Ward likes to do that. I mean, he obviously has shown that he can run a very fast 5 furlongs on a straightaway, so maybe that's where you do want to go with him. Yeah, he's a very fast horse, and I don't know what to make of the others in this field. I will just add on to what you said about You Better Believe It, who did break very slowly in this race, and credit to his rider, Rowan Scott, who got him right to the rail and really just cut that corner around the far turn to get up into third place and really put him in position to get a big piece of this race. Whereas I think most horses that had that kind of start in a 5.5 furlong turf sprint, I mean, the race would have been over at that point. And I mean, the European riders, I know sometimes people get a little bit leery of them riding these American style turf courses, but I mean, they put a lot of the American riders to shame in some of these Breeders' Cup turf races. I thought he gave one of the best rides of the weekend on that third place finisher.
Yeah, those guys did their homework for sure. I guess what I was trying to say earlier is Golden Pal just has this huge reputation right now, and I just don't see it. He's a horse that, I mean, who knows where he's going to show up, so I don't want to get too down on a horse that's won most of his race, won his last 2 races, looked good in 3 of the 4 on turf, all 3 on turf. He's run very well, but it's just a case where I think the reputation's way better than what the numbers are showing.
I can't argue with that based on what the numbers came back as. He's a horse that has that reputation based on the way he trains in the morning and his globe-trotting trainer, but we'll see if he improves next year. He obviously has done what he needs to do so far. Well, that's all the racing to recap for Breeders' Cup weekend, and that's all we're going to cover because I think that was more than enough to digest for one podcast. We're going to try to get back on a more regular schedule than we've been on moving forward. It's the least busy part of the season for me, I know, with after the Breeders' Cup ending and now focusing on Aqueduct. So we can get back into the habit, I think, of doing the TimeformUS forecast, handicapping some races for the upcoming weekend. I'll admit, Craig, I didn't look yet to see if there are any graded stakes races coming up this weekend. There might be something at Churchill Downs, but we'll look at the different cards and see what's worth handicapping come Friday.
Yeah, sounds good to me. I'm available we'll come up with something for sure.
Sounds good. Remember that you can always listen to these TimeformUS podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, and SoundCloud. Wherever you get your podcast, just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for listening this week, and we'll be back with another podcast on Friday.